please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Well, call it the tale of a hug and a handshake and a landmark bear hug in the Korean peninsula as both North and South Korea agree to give peace a chance. Nearly 1,500 kilometers away from the demilitarized zone in Korea, Prime Minister Modi and China's Xi Jinping met face-to-face for their first ever informal summit and the first meeting after the truce in Doklam. Before we begin discussing what has been a truly historic day in international diplomacy, here's Maha Siddiqui reporting from Wuhan in China on the first day of the informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. Maha.
This will be Prime Minister Narendra Modi's fourth visit to China. In the past, he's even been hosted by Chinese President Xi Jinping at his hometown of Xi'an. But since then and now, a lot has changed, specifically the Doklam incident and India boycotting the Belt and Road Summit last year in May. This created a lot of strain in the relationship between India and China. And this informal meeting on the 27th evening and 28th morning is to dispel the misunderstandings between the two sides. No joint statement is expected, as has been told to us by our sources. However, both sides will look at a strategic communication to try and understand the domestic issues, sometimes compelling foreign policy making in the particular country. Meanwhile, this meeting is going to be held at Mao's villa in Wuhan, again holding a lot of significance because this indicates that China does hold optimism over here that things will get better between the two sides. India has a lot of outstanding issues with China as well, but specifics will not be flagged up in this meeting. This meeting is primarily to create trust between the two sides.
Well, from China now to South Korea, CNBC's Eunice Yoon reports from Seoul on the historic thaw in the Korean peninsula after 5 decades. Eunice.
This is potentially a major turning point in a conflict that has been going on since the end of World War II. Just a couple of moments ago, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un and the South Korean President Moon Jae-in held a press conference where they issued a joint declaration of peace. Here are some of the highlights. They declared the end of the Korean War. They said they want to move to a peace regime. They said they're going to set up liaison offices and they're going to have phased disarmament. And then probably of most interest to Washington, the total denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Now, this is just the formal side of what's been a fascinating day. I think it was fascinating to see Kim Jong-un actually speak at a press conference. And then beyond that, the whole day has been full of pleasantries and ceremonies. The two leaders in the morning were joking with each other before they had their official 100-minute meeting. And also, Kim Jong-un even signed the guest book at the Peace House at the DMZ, where he wrote, "A new history begins now." And these pleasantries and ceremonies are continuing right now. The two are actually at dinner with their wives, where they're dining on a multi-course meal that includes Pyongyang-style noodles, as well as a dessert that has the map of the Korean peninsula on it. And I think this really sets the stage for what is going to be some very hard discussions, but could be a potentially interesting summit between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Trump. So there are a couple points, though, that I wanted to make here, though, and that we have seen joint declarations before. In the past, since 2000, there have been 2 other summits that have ended in similar language for joint declarations. We still don't know what the intentions are of Kim Jong-un and just how serious he is when it comes to these types of peace declarations. And there also were some vocabulary issues within the joint declaration. Some North Korea wonks will say that the use of peace treaty wasn't included. Instead, it's peace regime, so it gives North Korea potentially an out. So there are some other issues here that need to be worked out, but there are definitely reasons to be encouraged here.
Well, joining us now to discuss the road ahead, 2 former senior diplomats, K.C. Singh and Pinak Chakravarti. Also joining us from Beijing, Ina Tanje, political and economic commentator. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. Ambassador Singh, let me start by asking you, what do you believe is the catalyst from the Chinese position to ensure that this informal summit does in fact take place? I'm quoting to you what the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister says. He says, we want to come up with an overarching long-term vision for the next 100 years to deepen bilateral cooperation and properly handle our differences. How do you explain this meeting, given what a fractious year we've had between India and China?
Well, the Chinese seem to treat 100 years or 1,000 years the way we deal with decades. You remember the famous statement of a Chinese prime minister when asked what he thought of the French Revolution. He said, we are waiting for the results. So that's China for you. Now, what is driving them is different from what are the objectives. The objectives are, we share them. That's what we want. That's what Prime Minister said in his opening statement, which was a bit strange because for an informal summit, we saw pictures of a plenary because there were two delegations seated and they were opening statements. So I would call it a semi-official or a semi-informal thing.
So not all that informal.
It's not all that informal because there was a plenary and there was a prepared statement which was there. But what is driving is, we've been seeing a shift, the thaw, from about end of February when Foreign Secretary Gokhale went to China. He came back and wrote that letter to Cabinet Secretary saying we need a low-key participation in Dalai Lama's 60th anniversary of his arrival in India.
So that's the process of where the give and take started.
Where we started, we sent a signal that we are willing to distance, show some daylight between us and Dalai Lama, which is a major thing for China. And then it began thereafter. And more recently, Global Times, which is used as the bad policeman by China quite often, has been gushing about relationship with India, about change in India, change in China. So all that is, why is it happened? Now, a number of factors can be, we can argue and make a number of points. One is, of course, Trump. Trump has been putting his money where his mouth was. He started imposing duties. He said that it'll go further. There's economic aggression on us, intellectual property, etc., etc. Companies like ZTE, it's the second largest telecom company of China. If it doesn't get the chips from Qualcomm, it essentially kills its handset business because they can't go to somebody else. So Chinese are beginning to realize that this is not just a bluff. The Americans Trump may move further and be a disruptive force in terms of their export effort, in terms of their production. Now, if there's one thing the Chinese Communist Party is scared of, which is any disruption in the economy. Because that is the pact that they have, because then the control of the Communist Party itself is threatened. And second is, just to finish very quickly, is the détente between North and South Korea, which, as it happens, is happening on the same day that the meeting in Wuhan is there. Did the Chinese know about it? Is it a coincidence? But certainly the Chinese are concerned about it because the Prime Minister, the chairman of DPRK and the president of Korea, holding hands and crossing that artificial barrier, etc., would be driving a lot of concern in Beijing, because that's a buffer which China has used for decades to tie down Japan, tie down Americans, tie down Republic of Korea. Now, if there's reunification, it's an entirely new game in East Asia.
Let me go across now to Mr. Chakravarti. Mr. Chakravarti, you just heard what Ambassador Singh had to say on the possible catalyst. You know, in terms of the timing, again, I go back to quoting the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister saying that this was not China's idea or India's idea. It was a joint idea that was conceived at the BRICS summit a week after, in fact, Doklam. So whether the date was fixed then, I don't know, but apparently this was decided at the BRICS summit. What do you make of this coming together, and what should we hope then in terms of the road ahead? Expectations are building up. While I have to say that the Indian side has been much more measured in terms of the outcome and the expectations, and perhaps that's rightfully so, because you've already seen parties like the Congress Party posing questions to the Prime Minister saying, are you going to bring up the issue of Doklam, come back with some sort of a resolution on issues like that? So what do you make of the road ahead from here on, if this is indeed a new starting point?
Now, of course, Doklam, whatever has happened there is now, I mean, it's quiet, but it could happen again. And I think that shook up the system a bit. And I think since then there have been moves and counter moves to I think, to reach some kind of understanding, which is now culminating in this extraordinary summit, which is, as my colleague K.C. Singh described, as semi-formal and also a little free. I mean, there is nothing freewheeling about the Chinese way of doing things. I think it is all very choreographed. And so I think the expectations are there. But I think we are being cautious, and rightly so, because you know, we do have a problem with the Chinese in the sense, do they really mean it? And would they actually look at India's core concerns? You know, India's, you know, has certain core concerns.
Yeah.
The Chinese are, of course, also a little, I think, worried that the BRI, which has taken some battering now from various quarters, including India, but also from other places where it is being seen as kind of, you know, getting countries into a debt bondage for many, many years.
Yeah.
So I think all those factors are at play here. Then also that the market, that the Indian market growing at 7.5% is important for China.
Right.
China has a very large you know, trade surplus with India. And so I think those are all the factors that are going into it. There is also the factor that, you know, there should not be any, you know, inadvertent slide into a conflict, howsoever sort of minimal it might be.
Right.
Because that can create a trigger reaction and spread and beyond control. So I think all those factors, I think, are at play. The two leaderships, and the other is the domestic factor in China.
Yeah.
And the Chinese feel that there is a domestic factor in India because the election year is coming. And for China, President Xi now is in full control, having, I suppose, vanquished all his opponents so that he can take more decisive action, particularly his control over the PLA, which has always been a very powerful player in the Chinese system.
Sure.
So I think this is a good beginning. Let us see what happens. I am not very confident that major sort of things will happen.
Yes.
But things like, you know, renewing, you know, with greater confidence the border sort of dialogue and addressing the trade imbalance, also some investment and other issues that will happen, terrorism, for example.
So you're saying largely
China
bilateral
does have
issues.
A huge influence over Pakistan, and they can get Pakistan to so I think listen to them to some extent. And if that helps, so be it. And I think that would help India as well.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure that India would like that, but I don't know if that is going to be an issue that will be brought up at this informal or semi-formal summit that's currently underway. Let me bring in Inar as well. Inar, thanks very much for joining us. You know, both our guests here talking about some of the triggers or the catalysts. Trump, North Korea and South Korea coming together. You know, those are the external factors that China could be looking at in order for it to be able to cement this relationship with India. From India's perspective, as we've heard, you know, any confrontation is bad news, and obviously the Chinese would not like an escalation either. What, to your mind, is the big force behind this coming together at this point?
Well, it's a sea change in what's happening in the world. You know, prior to this time, what you had was capital, the Western capital in the EU and the United States basically made the rules, whether it was through the IMF, the World Bank, or proxy entities. But now you see markets taking their place. You know, what you mentioned before, India growing at 7.5%, China growing at 6.8%. Contrast that with the EU and the United States, who are growing at much less than half of each one of those. So when you start putting that together, you realize that, you know, this 60% of the capital that is concentrated in the West has nowhere to go. How are they going to get yield? You know, having lots of money, if you don't invest it and you don't grow it, it will shrink. So therefore, they're in this position where China and India are 40% of the world population. And together, they have a larger middle-class population than the entire population of China and India. So when you start, I mean, the U.S. and Europe. So when you start looking at that, now is the time for China and India to get together and take equal seating instead of being kind of colonial leftovers. Sit at the table and say what it is that they need in order to grow. And the combination of India and China is absolutely frightening to many in the West because they now realize that they do not control the future simply because they have the money. They have to come to the table and talk to these things. So, yes, there are all sorts of issues. You can argue over goat pastures at Doklam. You can talk about national pride issues. But if China and India are going to prosper, they need to have a plan. They need to have leverage. And this leverage is not about leverage of China over India.
Right.
It's India and China acting together to take their place in a multilateral world.
Ambassador Singh, let me get you to respond to the point that we just heard there from Eno, that, you know, this is a frightening combination for the rest of the world. How do you, for instance, see the U.S. reacting to this? I mean, I'm sure that they will take note of this informal summit that's currently underway. We've spoken at length about this possibility of this co-opetition model between India and China. The concept of Chindia was talked about for several years. People like Jairam Ramesh, coining that term. But do you really believe that that is a real possibility today?
Look, what India has been saying is we are looking at a multipolar world. We don't want any new polarities to determine a new Cold War, a new kind of competition. So in a multipolar world, you're looking at India being able to work with various powers. It's also being called multi-alignment rather than non-alignment. So you got in one group, say, Russia, India, China. You work with them. In the other group, you've got, we even revived the Quad.
Yeah.
We are working separately with Japan. We are working with US. So India is a swing power. It cannot put all its eggs in one basket. And it'll depend.
As it shouldn't.
Yeah. And therefore, the success of India would depend on how to manage these two rival groupings, which have any number of friction points. And I think what they're doing in Wuhan is to see whether China is willing to look at India as having a legitimate space in Asia as the two powers rise. Because the feeling till now is that the Chinese are not cutting any slack to anyone, whether in South China Sea, East China Sea, or on the subcontinent. And therefore, Chinese have also to step back. We've already stepped back from their points of irritation, which is Dalai Lama or whatever else they have. But they have to also, you take CPEC, a solution can be found to India beginning to accept the Belt and Road Initiative. But would they be able to bring Pakistan to the table where we get east-west connectivity? India has no interest in CPEC as in any way contributing to Indian economy or India's competitiveness. But if we get the east-west connectivity, it improves the chances of CPEC, but also brings something that India is interested in, which is access to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, or even Europe that way. So if the Chinese are willing to do the big shift, which is a strategic shift where they don't automatically arm Pakistan, give them nuclear weapons, missile technology, they're already losing probably one of their puppets, North Korea. Then I think that's the beginning of an understanding where there is trust that begins to develop. Once there is trust, very specifically on the border, 2005 agreement had laid down the principles for settling the border. Now, Chinese after 2008 stepped back. SR special representatives meetings have amounted to nothing. Every year they meet. There's nothing that new that happens. Are Chinese willing to go back to 2005 and say, yes, we will resolve the border issue? Of course, it may not get resolved tomorrow, but at least start talking about it. And once that happens, India will do some shifting, allow their investment to come in, more trust in Chinese money coming in, opening up other sectors of Indian economy, and maybe doing something to balance the trade. Last year, $84 billion, 16 billion Indian exports, 68 theirs. It's 3 times the Indian exports to China. So all this can happen once there is trust. Will that begin? That is what Wuhan is about.
Well, that could be what Wuhan is about. Mr. Chakravarti, how confident do you feel about this big shift that Ambassador Singh was talking about the fact that perhaps on some contentious areas we could see a degree of pullback on the part of China? I mean, India, I would imagine, is concerned about China's growing relevance in the subcontinent. Could we see a shift in that equation, perhaps, on trade and investment, an issue that you talked about as well? I mean, what are the points of give and take where you believe that the Chinese would be more willing to concede some ground?
Well, I think without conceding some ground, there is no hope in hell for India to accept what the Chinese are trying to sell to India, in the sense that whatever the Chinese want, then India can simply go back to the drawing board and go back to where we were, and sort of then we'll have to again rethink our whole policy. Now, the point is that that there are opportunities. I don't say that there are no opportunities. We know that China is making inroads into our neighborhood through infrastructure, under the garb of infrastructure, but some of these are, could be very strategic kind of investments, ports, for example. I mean, we have seen the Gwadar port and the CPEC, and then we have seen in Djibouti, they have opened a base. So there are moves made by China which do give indication that they are moving into the Indian Ocean and creating their own strategic space in this area. Now, how does it is bound to impact on India. So the question is, do we draw some lines, mutually agreeable lines, that China respects as far as India is concerned, and India respects as far as China is concerned? And I think if I were to identify one major factor is, of course, to build confidence, I would say, is the border, border issue. At least some element of progress on the border issue would add to that confidence. Some element of changes in the BRI structure and the way BRI is being handled could also be useful, because India could then consider some aspects of the BRI, infrastructure. India also needs infrastructure. Then, or instead of joining the BRI, India can open up a little more to Chinese investments. 50% of the mobile market is in India is, in any case, it's in Chinese hands now. So, and there are many other areas where China could come in. I mean, railways, and China has made remarkable progress, even in technological terms, in many of these areas, and would be useful for them, for us, for our economy, to get into some of the arrangements that with China to build infrastructure. I think infrastructure is a major thing for India, and I think Chinese can contribute to that. But then overall understanding is necessary, because which would of course involve give and take. And I think that
which is the point that Ambassador Singh made. That Wuhan needs to be the starting point of creating
Wuhan will have to
be studied. Which needs to be the starting point of creating or getting beyond the trust deficit that currently exists. Einar, I'll end by asking you, we've got two historic meets on, the meeting between North Korea and South Korea on the same day as this meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. What is occupying mind space in China at this point in time?
Well, at this point in time, I mean, China is realizing, as I think the rest of the world is, that Trump is not the center of the universe, that things can happen outside, that India and China can get together, that the North and South Korea can take an armistice and make it into a peace agreement. I think this is very important. But, with my other two colleagues, what I'm hearing a lot of is the glass is half empty. And I think it is time for both countries to look and say that glass is half full. The fact is, it's not a question. China does not have to invest in India. India needs investment. China needs markets. Together, they can be greater than the sum of their parts. So this idea that it all begins with disputes over goat pastures and that this will do it, I don't understand. Even if the border was resolved tomorrow, would it make any difference to the average Indian in terms of their income and opportunities? I don't think so. So I think from here on out, instead of doubting everything, we should take a positive attitude, try to say, how can these two entities work together to create something that's better than what they have? Otherwise, China and India will continue to be under the yoke of, basically colonial powers who are lording it over them because they have capital. Right? If you want to escape this cycle, it is time to take a fresh look at things and look at the possibilities instead of the past.
All right, look at the possibilities instead of the past. That's a good note to end this conversation on. Einar, Ambassador Singh and Mr. Chakravarti, appreciate you joining us here on this CNBC TV18 special. There is going to be no joint communique or joint statement at the end of this, so we will wait to see what the results are of this historic semi-formal summit in Wuhan. From all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.